Our reading from the Gospel for this morning is from the Gospel of John, and I'll be reading from chapter 6, verses 1 through 21. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him, because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not be enough to buy bread for each of them to get even a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also with the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This indeed is the prophet who has come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because of a strong wind blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Would you pray with me? Good and gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our heart this day be found truly acceptable in your sight. For you are our strength. You are our Redeemer. Amen. Got a pretty good response from the children's sermon this morning. They knew right where we were at when we were talking about yes and no, didn't they? That's pretty important to all of us as we get older. There's even a commercial on TV, I think it's for Discover Card, that is trying to prop up the idea that there is no annual fee for Discover Card, and they have all these celebrities there that are saying no in all sorts of different ways. From, I think it's Alicia, let's see, I can't think of her name now. The guy from Friends was there saying no, 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 all these different ways of saying no. Maybe you've heard the commercial. I love that commercial, but it reminds me of just how many times we hear the word no in the course of a day. It's either rolling off our tongues or it's finding its way into our ears, but no certainly seems to be part of our lives. I read somewhere that as human beings, we have a thirst for limits and boundaries. We like to know just how far we can go, just how much we can get away with in life. When our son was small and we went to high school basketball games, we had some ground rules. If you wanted to leave the gym to use the restroom or get a snack, he had to walk outside that black line that marks the edge of the basketball court. We were very clear about that. We stressed it over and over again as we drove to the basketball game. We said, don't step over the line and onto the court. So we get there, and he walks down the bleacher steps, and he stops at the bottom at the edge of the court. And he turns around, and he looks up at my wife and I, and he does this. And then pulls back and goes on off to the restroom or off for a snack. He didn't like the sound of the word no, but he wanted to make sure he knew what his boundaries were. He wanted to know where he stood. And we told him when he got home. That seems to be a basic need in our lives too, doesn't it? We like to know the rules. We want to believe that there's a way to live life that is proper, where we know how to behave and live together. We won't know quite what to do when that order breaks down. Isn't that where you find yourselves with each breaking news story of a crisis or a conflict? Don't you feel a little bit uneasy, a little bit anxious when you see the edge of order sort of fraying just a little bit? Does it strike you that a cog in the machinery of society maybe has slipped just a little bit? We shake heads when we see our elected officials behaving in ways that we don't understand. We read about shootings and wonder how anyone could do something like that. There have to be some boundaries and some limits that dictate the way that we live together. And sometimes those boundaries are defined by our saying no, by the word no. And it was no different in Jesus' day. People knew their limitations. People understood what the boundaries were. They were aware of the consequences if lines were crossed. And if doubts, there was a whole cast of religious leaders who were just itching to fill in the blanks and tell anyone who would ask what the rules and the boundaries and the limits were that defined a person's relationship with God. They were more than eager to tell a person if they were in or out, if they were on the inside or on the outside. And most of the time, folks were told about how they needed to know the rules of the game. They were told all the things that they should not do if they wanted to make God happy and enjoy God's favor and love. In other words, they heard no a lot. So how is it with you this morning? Does it seem like God is saying no to you a lot? I know some of you are struggling with issues in life. COVID has thrown us all for a loop. We think the worst is behind us, and then we hear words of infection spiking again. You may have been praying and praying for things to turn around and get back to normal, whatever that might be, for God to guide you, for God to keep you healthy, for help with the bills or anything, and when nothing happens, that seems like a no from God. The issue might be family relationships. It might be a feeling of lostness or loneliness, and God just doesn't seem to be listening. The no's just keep on coming. If any of this seems to be hitting home for you, then you know something of the mindset of the folks in the first century who were drawn to Jesus' message, who felt led to follow Jesus. It seems like wherever Jesus went, he drew a crowd and things happened. Suddenly, it seemed like years of no were being turned to yes. Can you imagine what that must have been like? People were being healed. Miracles were happening. John reports that 5,000 people were fed by Jesus using only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. We've heard that story often, over and over again. It's one of those stories in the Gospels that rings true to us. But yet, it's amazing, isn't it? 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And not only were the people fed, John says, but everybody ate their fill until they were satisfied and could not eat a single bite more. And there were baskets of food left over. No wonder people were excited too. If they hung out with this Jesus, not only would they be healed, but they'd also be well fed. What more could people ask for? This is a yes that went beyond their wildest dreams. In John's gospel, the author talks a lot about the signs that Jesus offered to his people. In this story, it says, a large group kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. And after all those folks were fed, John reports, when the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, this indeed is the prophet to come into the world. Now, when I see that word sign, I think of a tool that's used to point me in a new direction, to get my attention to focus in a different way. We need to be reminded that God is constantly trying to get our attention so that we'll look at the world around us in different ways, through new eyes. And when we do that, we're awarded with the gift of seeing God at work in ways that we never expected. We read that Jesus fed all those folks, and their natural response was to follow him wherever he went, because they knew that he had the potential to take care of their hunger problem. And their immediate reaction, according to what John writes, was to come and take him by force and make him king. He was going to be their gravy train. He was going to be the answer to their needs. And isn't that just like us? Once we find something that seems to work, once we find that magic answer that seems to solve all of our problems, that seems to get us more yeses, we want to rein it in and control it for ourselves. But Jesus wasn't having any of that. He retreated. He headed for the hills. He went up to the mountain. You see, the point is that this miracle of feeding the crowd is only a sign of Jesus' salvation. It's not salvation itself. Feeding the hungry is a sign of Jesus' larger purpose, of his greater ministry. Jesus doesn't want to be made a king who will just keep producing more Wonder Bread. Jesus knows that in the long run, the business of eating and drinking is just a dead end. We know that one meal can sustain us just for so long, and then we need to eat again. And it's the same with life's routine of eating and drinking. It only keeps us going for just so long, for just so many years, and then we will all die. The bread of this earth cannot keep us alive forever. Jesus was saying yes when he fed all those folks, but it was a small yes that was given as a sign that pointed to a much bigger yes of God's love for all of creation. It's also important to remember that Jesus offered this sign right around the celebration of the Passover. You remember Passover is that time when folks across the land were turning their attention to this mighty act of God in their past, where God gave freedom to their ancestors who had been slaves in Egypt, giving them freedom. Jesus was offering them a sign that God was still that same freedom-giving God now that they had worshipped back then. And God was about to say yes again to them in a big way that went far beyond filling their bellies or restoring their health. What Jesus did that day for those 5,000 folks on the mountainside was wonderful. It came as a sign of the kingdom, but it was not the kingdom. To get at the real reason Jesus had come, to solve the deeper problems that come to us with life and death, Jesus had to say something else, which is what he goes on to do in the last part of John chapter 6. He presents himself as the true bread of life. Somehow, by giving up his life, we can find a new form of life, life eternal. And that, friends, is the ultimate yes in the face of all the questions that we ask about the meaning of life. Why things happen that don't make any sense to us. What will tomorrow bring? Where is God when I'm so afraid of what seems to be so much uncertainty about the future? We've either gotten used to settling for no, or have gotten used to receiving yes that really doesn't satisfy. This morning's reading from John concluded with the disciples heading out across the sea to get away from the crowds. And for some reason, they'd left Jesus behind, which has never quite made sense to me. And as they made their way across the water, a storm came up. The wind was blowing, John says, and the waves were crashing over the boat. But we also know that these fishermen had some experience. According to what John writes, at this point there wasn't any fear in their hearts. They'd fought storms like this before. We're told they just kept on rowing. They rowed for 3 or 4 miles. Can you imagine that in the midst of a storm? No fear in their hearts at all. And then they saw Jesus. And he was walking on the water to join them. And then, John says, they were terrified. Now, that's kind of strange. What is it about the power? What is it about being in the presence of power that is beyond our control that scares us so much? People crowded around this miracle worker who could fill their bellies, but cried out in fear when they witnessed the power of life over death. And what does Jesus say to them? It is I. Do not be afraid. Now, it's really important to know that in Greek, John quotes Jesus calling out to the disciples in the boat saying, ego eimi, which translates, I am. Now, where would folks in Jesus' day have heard those words before? They'd be asked to recall way back in the book of Exodus, when God called Moses to be the one to lead the people out of Egypt to freedom. And Moses asked him for some credentials for this voice that was coming out of the bush, that was on fire but not being consumed. And out of the fire, the voice answered, tell them, I am has sent you. The God of the ages, the God of all creation, has become one of us in the person of Jesus Christ. That was what the disciples heard. I am. Do not be afraid. What could be a bigger yes than that? All the no's that we deal with each day are powerless before this yes, because this yes is eternal. Now as then, we are way too eager to settle for a quick fix, like bread that will fill our bellies but will leave our souls wanting. Today, again, we have an invitation to stick with Jesus over the long haul and follow him all the way to the cross. It's not a quick fix. It looks like the end of everything. But do not be afraid when you look at that cross. In Jesus Christ, God is yes for us. Not just in the here and now, but forever. Amen. Amen. Would you join me in prayer? Gracious God, we come to you hurting, perhaps stinging from too many no's that we have heard in our lives, too many painful responses to where you would have us go and what you would have us do and how you would have us be. But help us reach out and hold on tightly to the yeses that you have for us in Jesus Christ, and rejoice in each day of life that you give to us in his name. Amen.